Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or actually at this point, I guess it is technically afternoon. Um, Making a quick and informal video here, just trying to make sure that we don't fall behind in our lecture notes. As we're coming to the end of the semester, like I've said, I need you to keep up with the reading, so that we can make sure that we're all prepped and prepared for the final. You will notice that I put the writing guide for the second paper on the Moodle site for us, so you can take a look at that. As I mentioned before, that writing guide is basically saying do the same thing that you did last time, except this time there's sort of a prompt and a question there to guide you. And that the question's pretty straightforward. It's basically asking you to look at one of the key themes in U.S. history, rights, democracy, liberty, equality, that kind of thing, and ask how did that change over time? Because really that's what the study of history is it's studying change over time. To do that, you will use lecture notes, your readings, videos. You'll use documents from the Voices of Freedom. You must use at least one. I would encourage you to try to use two Voices of Freedom documents, maybe one from towards the beginning of class. But make sure that at least one of those Voices of Freedom documents come from the second half of class, okay? So that you're kind of getting the big picture. What I don't want to see is a paper about the Gilded Age, okay? Like that's too limited. You need to be looking big here, sort of the long term. I don't want to see a paper about the 1980s or about the 2000s, right? I want to see a paper about how things used to be, and then how things, kind of changed over time. So my suggestion would be, as far as for organization, maybe look at 3 points of comparison. Try to use very specific examples. This is something that I say in that outline. Is be specific. Don't talk about there was labor union violence in the 19th century. Talk about the Pullman strike, talk about Haymarket, talk about, don't talk about in the progressive era things changed for women. What changed? More women went to work in these different kinds of jobs. Women got the right to vote because of these suffragettes and this suffragette movement and how it played out or whatever. And kind of be specific with those things. One that I often see is Americans grew more conservative while also some Americans grew more liberal. Okay, yeah, that's not revolutionary. Be specific with in what ways did these people grow more conservative, or in what ways did these people grow more liberal? What do you mean by liberal and conservative? Who grew more liberal? Who grew more conservative? And be careful with this, because this is also something that I've seen quite a bit of, is people will say, well, young people grew more liberal. Okay, great. But those young people eventually get older. So did they stay liberal? Did they become more conservative as they got older? How did it work? What I'm basically saying is don't generalize, okay? That's your enemy in this paper. Also, remember to make sure that you're quoting from Voices of Freedom, so that you're using those documents as evidence. And that was where a few of you lost some points in your paper. For the first half of class, don't lose those points here. Okay? And it's as simple as any paper that does not quote Voices of Freedom well and extensively cannot receive an A. It's just how I grade these, because you're not following directions. Okay? So follow directions, read that document, get set up for that. You'll also see by Monday you'll have the final exam study guide that will go up, just like the study guide did for the first half of the class for the midterm, okay? So that way you'll have that over Thanksgiving break and you can begin to study there, all right? So, on to notes. You'll see me glancing to the side. It's because that's where I have my notes propped up. Sorry, I'm sitting in my living room in just a t-shirt and a hat because I was outside cleaning off some cars. I was helping my neighbor who's a little bit of an older gentleman. I was trying to help him and such, and then I wanted to get this made quickly and up for you. So anyway, we are talking about the greatest generation. This is a phrase that you'll hear. It was made famous by Tom Brokaw, the news reporter and whatnot. And in his reporting, he used that phrase, and it's a phrase that's a bit controversial, because this greatest generation is also, they are the generation that stopped fascism in Europe. They are also a generation that segregated blacks in the United States. They're a generation, that survived the Great Depression, but they're also a generation that became increasingly consumer-oriented and increasingly acquisitive. And so, when I was a little bit younger of a man, I used to get really angry when I would hear people talk about, the greatest generation. And I was, always kind of asked, well, by what standard? And that's a valid question, by what standard? Now, I would encourage people, now maybe I guess that I'm a little bit older, I've had the chance to kind of sit back and think on it some and say, by stopping fascist aggression and by checking the power of the Soviet Union, and by building the economy out of the ashes of the Great Depression and out of the uncertainty of the Second World War, this generation helped to set the stage for the reforms and the changes that would take place in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, in civil rights for women, for people of color and such. And so maybe I can give them a little bit more slack nowadays, because I've sort of taken on a little bit more of the big picture view of it. You'll have to trust me. It happens when you get older. All right, okay. Anyway, we talked about the end of the New Deal. By the way, just before I go further, these PowerPoints are up on Moodle. There will be 2 PowerPoints that I'll be using today. One is the Greatest Generation PowerPoint. The other one is the PowerPoint, I believe, is titled The Nightmare Years, but I believe it's under Post-War America till 1960 or something along those lines. So you can download those PowerPoints and you can follow along with them, or you can use them to follow along with this video as we go, okay? So we had talked about World War II, how it started, how it ended, just sort of the general battle picture there and whatnot. There's a really good Ken Burns documentary, I believe it's on Netflix still, that if you're into looking at World War II, the conflict in more detail, there's that. There are many history courses at the higher levels that are very, very good that go into great detail on this kind of stuff. But for us, our concern is going to mostly be with how this worked in the home front. We talked about unemployment dropped, from 14% at the war's outbreak to 2% by the war's end. Of course, as we said, part of this is due to the huge number of people who have gone into the military and are overseas fighting. They're not taking jobs. So a question that you should file in the back of your head is, what's going to happen when those people come back and need jobs? All right. How is that going to affect the economy? All right. There was also a massive shift during the war of the economy being primarily private, where it was, dominated by private business and private enterprise, into what we call a wartime economy, which is where the government has to start buying a lot of stuff and spending a lot of money, and this will create jobs. They have to buy not just bombs and tanks and planes and guns, those things that we use to fight the war, but they also have to buy uniforms for the soldiers, tents for the soldiers to sleep in. They have to get food for them. They have to, you know, buy boats to transport things. They have to buy cargo containers, crates. So they buy wood, you know, for the crates and such. There's so many things that go into the making and the maintenance of a modern army that we often forget. And so the government stepped in this way, and we had talked about in World War One, you know, there was government intervention. The government, you know, told people what to make and how much to sell it for and such. And that is even more thoroughgoing in World War II. And this will give rise to a thing we call the military-industrial complex. And we'll talk about that more when we get towards Korea and Vietnam. But it's this notion that the government and industry both benefit from war. And, you know, the government benefits because during time of war, people tend to be more patriotic in the sense of, you know, they are less likely to criticize government. It also benefits government because it keeps unemployment low, which keeps people happy, and it keeps the economy humming. And it benefits business and industry because the government's buying stuff. And if government has one major problem when it comes to buying stuff, it's that they always pay too much for it. This is just the way it goes. Government is an inefficient consumer because there's only really one government, so there's not competition between consumers for the goods. If the government wants to buy planes from me, no one else is trying to buy planes. No one else is fighting for those goods. You know, likewise, the number of people making planes is fairly low, and so they can pretty much charge what they want. So this intermingling of government and business, particularly on a wartime footing and such, becomes a bit of a concern for some people, and they'll start to refer to this as the military-industrial complex. Also, at this time during the war, this is when payroll taxes were first taken out of people's checks. This is, you know, a place where the government froze wages and told unions, you know, that they couldn't strike. And yes, this was FDR, the great friend of the working man, the great friend of the poor, telling workers, if you don't work, you'll be thrown in jail. You know, because again, there was a higher need. There was a need for the workers and a need for stability. We talked about the four freedoms briefly, this notion, you know, that we were fighting for freedom of worship, freedom of speech, but also freedom from want and freedom from fear. If you remember back when we talked about positive liberty and negative liberty, this kind of ties into that, right? Freedom of speech is freedom from being restrained. In other words, no one is trampling on your right. No one is prohibiting you. Freedom of worship is, you know, there is no prohibition on your method of worship. And that's negative liberty, right? That's liberty of contract. That is, you know, that whole sort of realm. But then there was positive liberty, which is basically saying, you know, the government's going to help you do stuff. And that's this freedom from want, right? This is the government's going to prop up your ability to buy the things that you want, you know, to make sure that you have enough food, clothing, housing, and such, that you have everything that you need and some of the things that you want. I always told my kids that was my goal, was to give them everything that they needed and some of the things that they wanted. Can't have it all, but that's a pretty good place to start. And that was kind of what the government's trying to do here. We're going to make sure that you all can eat, that you all have jobs, that you know, may not be the best job, may not be the job that you always dreamed of, but you're going to have a job. You're not going to starve, right? We're going to make sure that you're secure. You know, yes, there's going to be crime. Yes, there's going to be negative things in the country, but it's not going to be fascist Germany. You know, we're not going to get overrun by the Nazis, you know. And so this conception of positive liberty, the government doing for you or helping you to do, and negative liberty, the government getting out of your way so that you can do what you want to do. These are competing ideas in American culture and history, all the way back to the Puritans, all the way back, well, before this class started. We even saw that back when we talked about Reconstruction, that there were some people who wanted the government to give the former slaves 40 acres and a mule. That's positive liberty. That's the government helping you to achieve, helping to right some wrong, right? But then there were people who said the best way is to simply let black folks do for themselves. This was Booker T. Washington. You remember Du Bois, Washington, that great debate? It's going on before them, it goes on after them. Washington was saying, look, just let us do our thing, get out of our way, and we'll make things for ourselves. We'll build businesses. Just don't discriminate. In other words, don't throw up roadblocks. But you don't have to boost us up. Whereas Du Bois was saying, no, we could use the boost for the talented 10th, and then the talented 10th will pull up the other 90%. Right? So, but the fifth freedom was one I think that we stopped at, and that was, the freedom kind of to consume. And this one becomes more problematic in a lot of ways. It's this, freedom, not just freedom from want, but freedom to have what you want, freedom to pursue your own good at the expense of anything. The picture, if you're looking at it, chocolate is a fighting food, and it was this freedom to get back to the days when we could buy chocolate, because there was actually a huge shortage of chocolate in the United States during this period, because we were giving chocolate to the soldiers because it's got sugar in it, and sugar gives you energy, and you want your soldiers to have energy for those long marches, for those tough fights. And so getting back to a country where you could buy a chocolate bar. I don't remember the year. I believe it was 1942. It was either 42 or 43. But one of those 2 years, there were no new cars that were made by Ford or Chrysler. There are no model, I think it was 42, no model 42, Fords or, Chryslers, because the government said you can't build them. Because we need that metal, that rubber, especially the rubber. We need the rubber for the war effort, because most rubber at that time came from the South Pacific, which was now controlled by Japan, with whom we were at war. And even though we made great strides in creating synthetic rubber during this period, and in fact, it's one of the reasons why nowadays most rubber is made in a lab rather than harvested from a tree, there was still a huge shortage of rubber. And so, one of the sort of pushes was to get back to this place where we could build cars. And you could buy a new model car, and it was no stress, no big deal. You didn't have to worry about that stuff. All right. So this sort of consumer freedom also creeps in, using freedom less as a concept in American politics and more as a marketing tool. All right. There is a short video that is embedded in the PowerPoint here. And it's a sort of cartoon flip book video that was created based on a book called The Road to Serfdom. And this book, The Road to Serfdom, was challenging Roosevelt's notion that the government's intervention and government planning could be beneficial, because it asks the question, where does it stop? Where does this government planning stop? And at what point does the government's drive to make everything better begin to interfere with your liberty to pursue happiness, life, liberty, and happiness in your own way? When the government tells you that you can't strike, isn't that violating your fundamental human rights to alienate your own labor, as they would say if you've ever taken a course in econ. One of the fundamental economic rights is the alienation of your own labor, which is, that you can basically work for what you want to. You can do the thing that you want to do, and if it fails, it's your problem that it fails, not everybody else's, right? And so this, government intervention this way becomes a bit of a problem. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. We'll probably look at this video quickly when we get back to class on Monday, simply because, it's a really important theme. It's going to become like the sort of dominant Republican battle cry, frankly, through much of the 1960s and really the 1970s and 80s. The modern Republican sort of free market capitalism stance is largely based on works like this book, The Road to Serfdom. All right. The thing that we haven't really talked about much, and I don't want to belabor the point, but is this atom bomb and what it does. First of all, 140,000 Japanese were killed in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I believe it was 140,000 combined. No, actually, you know what? I'm wrong. It was 140,000 at Hiroshima, so straight away. It was a combined death toll of 400,000 plus, over 400,000 combined in those two cities. And now that's also factoring in people who died from radiation sickness and the cancer from the fallout and all of that kind of stuff. All right. So this is a tremendous loss of life. And I mean, this is practically world-ending levels of destruction here. But there's been this tendency in modern scholarship and such, people kind of want to, paint this as the great mistake of the United States. And this just shows the evil of the U.S., and again, it's easy to play armchair quarterback, and argue that we, should not have dropped the bomb. The reality is it was expected to cost us over 1 million lives just in Japanese lives, and about 250,000 to 500,000 U.S. soldiers. So about 1.5 million, maybe 1.25 million people were expected to die in the invasion of Japan. That's just in the invasion, not in an occupation. So I tend to trust Truman here, maybe because I'm gullible, but I tend to trust Truman here and simply say he made the best choice that he could make, or what he thought was best given the information that he had. There were some people who say those numbers were estimated way high, and it wouldn't have cost us 1 million people. Some people saying, that the Japanese were ready to surrender. Yeah, they were, but they were going to surrender with conditions. And so this is problematic, right? Ultimately, this was also just sort of part of the general theme of total warfare that was part of the New World, part of this sort of modern era, where war was not going to simply be about two armies meeting on the field of battle somewhere and firing back and forth at each other. This was going to be, war that was fought in a much, say hi back, hi. Say hi to my students.
Hi, I'm back. I'm so sorry for interrupting your video.
That's okay, love. Anyway, yeah, she has off school today too. Anyway, so yeah, this was part of this sort of modern warfare, right, where the civilians were seen as viable targets. They were, people who could be targeted. And, this happened in Dresden, in Germany. We firebombed Dresden back to the Stone Age. This happened in the Battle of London, or what they call the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, where the Germans, bombed civilian targets like hospitals. In in Britain, they bombed residential communities and such. If anyone's ever read the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, the start of the Chronicles of Narnia, if you remember, the children are from London, but they're out in the country staying with this professor guy and whatnot. Well, that's because they were shipping the kids out of London because they were they were concerned about the kids dying in the bombings and such, whatever. There was a tremendous loss of life there. So again, not that I'm trying to be an apologist for United States foreign policy. I like to criticize the U.S. when I feel the U.S. deserves criticism. But in the middle of World War II, I'm not sure that it's fair to kind of charge the U.S. with this crime against humanity of bombing civilians, when in fact it was what everybody did in war during the Second World War. It's not something that was rare or uncommon. In fact, it would become the norm during the Korean War, during Vietnam, as time passed forward and such. So ultimately, the last thing that we really need to deal with World War II is the Iron Curtain and sort of what the world would look like coming out of World War II. Going into the First World War back in 1914, Great Britain and France and Germany were the three most powerful nations in Europe, followed by Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After the First World War, Germany was crushed, but had the potential to rebuild. France was crushed, but had the potential to rebuild. Britain was largely untouched. The Ottomans were gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was gone. And the Russians had become the Soviet Union and were in the middle of Leninist purges and 5-year plans, and they had their own civil war going. So out of the 6 major European powers in World War I that entered, only 3 of them survived, and only 1 of them survived largely intact. Then the Depression hits 10 years later, and that's not good for anybody. Germany rebuilds, France rebuilds to an extent, but Germany rebuilds, and the Soviet Union has become far more powerful. Going into World War II, Germany and Britain are the 2 strongest European powers. Germany overruns France. Again, remember, Austro-Hungarian Empire has now been split up. The Ottoman Empire has been split up and is, run by, part of it by France, part of it by Great Britain, and such. The Soviet Union, they're doing their own thing. By the end of the war, by the end of World War II, Germany will be shattered. And they'll be able to rebuild, but it's going to take time and it's going to take help. The Soviet Union will have lost 20 million civilians. Not soldiers, civilians. 20 million dead. This does not even include those that were killed by the Soviet Union itself, that were killed by Stalin in his purges. Right? This is just 20 million dead because of the war. They also probably lost another 20 million soldiers for approximately 40 million casualties. That is an enormous number. That is the cream of a generation lying dead on the frozen tundras of Western Russia. Germany's shattered. France is shattered. Britain's even been shattered because of the Blitz, because of the bombings and such, and just because they've had to spend so much blood and treasure to beat the Germans back. Italy, crushed. Austro-Hungary, well, as I said, they've gotten split up, but all those little countries in Eastern Europe there, Austria and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, they've been swallowed up by the German war machine. And so what are we going to do with those countries? How are we going to rebuild them? How are we going to reestablish them? The only country that really came out of the war better than it went in was the United States, because we were never really attacked on our own soil. Yes, I know Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor was a military target. And don't get me wrong, Pearl Harbor was a tragedy, the day that will live in infamy, right? But it was a military target. It was not New York City. It was not Chicago. The Japanese didn't wipe out, the entire meatpacking district of Chicago, or the entire, financial sector of New York. They wiped out a naval base. And so, after the war, the United States is going to be the one that is going to set the tone for the rest of the 20th century. This period we're going into, 1945 after, will be called by many the American century, because really we're the ones who come out of the war intact. We'll help France and Britain rebuild. We'll help Italy rebuild. We'll help Germany rebuild. We would have helped the Soviets, but the Soviets weren't interested. We helped Japan rebuild. And in doing so, we spread our influence across the globe, not necessarily through guns and bullets, although we had done that too, but we spread our influence through dollars. If you remember back in the progressive era, they talked about dollar diplomacy. This is the ultimate dollar diplomacy, where because we help people rebuild, which is what we'll be talking about in the 45 to 1960 section quite a bit, because of that, we end up having a lot of sway and a lot of influence in kind of what happens, right? So there were 3 conferences that you should know the names of: Tehran, Potsdam, and Yalta. And at these, it was the meeting of the big 3. And the big 3 was Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. You'll notice France is not represented there, right? Churchill's from Britain, Stalin's from Russia, Roosevelt's from the United States. France was led by a guy named Charles de Gaulle, who, he was an important figure. But France wasn't really a major player at this point. There wasn't a France. It was occupied by the Germans. So during these meetings, they started getting together and talking about what they wanted the world to look like post-war. And very quickly, it became apparent that it was not this great alliance, this big 3, was not going to hold together. Roosevelt and Stalin, Roosevelt really wanted Uncle Joe, he used to call him, Big Uncle Joe, Stalin, to, be allies. Churchill really made sure that didn't happen, in part because Churchill was smart enough to recognize the threat that the communists would pose to the post-war world system. There we go. So these conferences do a couple of major things, though. The first is that they basically set up, when the war's over, we're going to divide Germany into 4 zones. And one of those zones will be controlled by Britain, one by France, one by the U.S., and one by the Soviets. So they carve it up into spheres of influence. And they do this with Europe generally. They kind of say, we're going to, let the Soviets kind of have some control over some of these areas in Eastern Europe. Not that they're going to annex them, they're going to be their own countries, but they'll be in the Soviet orbit. The Soviets will have more influence there, more investment. And that'll form a buffer, because that was what Stalin really wanted coming out of this. He wanted some sort of wall, not like physical wall, but a wall of countries, a sort of shield, a buffer zone between the Soviets and the Germans, because he was not looking forward to another German invasion. They had invaded twice in the last 20 years. He really didn't want to see that happen for a third time. So they're also going to establish the Nuremberg trials, which are a fascinating subject that if you ever get a chance, read on it and whatnot. It's the sort of trial system for Nazi war criminals. And there's some interesting stuff that happens here. There's variety of people who are tried and sentenced to prison, tried and sentenced to death. Some of them aren't tried, or they just kind of disappear. And some of these Nazis who disappear end up in different places. Many of them actually end up in the United States. There were two different kinds of Nazis who disappeared. Some disappeared because they fled, and they ended up mostly in South America, places like Argentina, which was famous for sheltering Nazi war criminals. But some of them were actually saved by the U.S. government. We'll talk more about one of the most famous of those, a fellow named Klaus Barbie. We'll talk about him more when we talk about Guatemala and Nicaragua and the Sandinistas and what's going on with the U.S. involvement in Latin America. But the moral of the story here is that the Nuremberg trials don't kill all the Nazis. And it does become very difficult to figure out, do you want to put on trial some kid who was 18 years old and was just following orders? Well, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And it's interesting if you get a chance to read a book or watch a program on or something to see how they dealt with that problem of, what do we do with these people and how do we determine who are the really guilty ones who should be punished and who were kind of victims of the Nazis themselves, These meetings will also establish, really, probably the most important thing to come out of all of this, the United Nations. And with that, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank are established at a separate conference called the Bretton Woods Conference, but it's part of this whole process or whatever. And the purpose here is to basically take Enlightenment thinking and apply it to world politics and to the global community. Whether or not it's successful at doing that, or whether or not that's even a good idea, that's for you to decide as we finish up this course. But for now, it's probably enough to say that the UN does not have a particularly good record in preventing war. They just don't. But the idea that we could get together and all sit down and talk about these things, it's not new. We had that back in the Congress of Europe, or the Concert of Europe, sometimes called, after Napoleon. We had that after World War I. The difference here is that the U.S. gets involved. Remember, we were not willing to get involved in the League of Nations after the First World War. We will get involved here. In fact, we will lead this whole coalition. And that's important because with U.S. economic, political, and military support, the UN will be more effective than the League of Nations had ever been. They will also establish the doctrine of self-determination, which is something that we'll be talking about next time when we talk about Palestine and Israel, when we talk about India and sort of decolonization. That's going to be something that the United Nations is going to push for very, very hard. And that's going to have long-reaching consequences in world history and in U.S. history. It's going to help to determine who are our allies moving forward. And decolonization issues are the primary reason that the Vietnam War took place. So we end up there in large part because of some of the things that are happening here. We don't end up in Vietnam until the 60s. But, well, actually, I think we have a few people there in the late 50s. But we don't get involved in the war part of it until the 1960s. But the ground's being laid for it in late 1944 and in 1945. Okay, so next time when we get together, we'll be talking about the nightmare years, 45 to 53, and then sort of what we call the culture of consensus, like 53 to 1960. We want to talk about cars because cars are one of my favorite things ever to talk about in U.S. history. I know it sounds weird, but we'll be talking about the car quite a bit. We'll also be talking about rock and roll, its birth, a little bit about McCarthy, a little bit about some of that stuff, but your textbook covers that really well. What I feel like it misses is some of the sort of cultural history stuff, some of the less traditional history topics. And so we'll be focusing on those things in the 50s and the 60s, and even in the 70s too. Get ready to listen to some music because we're going to talk about what you can learn about American history by listening to Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, and well, not as much Zeppelin and the Beatles because they're British. But this is a point that we're going to discover, that because there's so much international trade and international influence happening, people are able to communicate and such back and forth more and more often and with more ease. We are going to start looking at the world a little bit more than we did when we were talking about 1870. All right. So anyway, thank you for understanding. Again, I am sorry to have canceled class unnecessarily. I've been in that position where I was an undergraduate student. I was a commuter, and it used to drive me nuts how long they would wait to cancel things, not being able to know, so not being able to plan. I just wanted to try to sort that out for us a little bit earlier, and figured you can watch this video. You don't even have to watch it. You can just listen to it, and hopefully get something from it. So until Monday, you all have a great day, and I will look forward to seeing you then. Bye-bye.